So welcome everyone to what is our suddenly the very last seminar of our Writing Transnational Girlhoods Across Literature, Media and Society seminar series. My name is Federica Coluzzi and I'm based at the University of Warwick. I'm one of the co-organizers of the series along with my colleague, Dr. Olga Campofreda. We're truly delighted to see so many of you here tonight for what will be a sort of a more hybrid event, because today, rather than having the usual like couple of presentations with Q&A, we're gonna start with an interview led by Olga with Giulia Blasi, and then we'll follow with a roundtable discussion with three speakers, invited speakers, Dr. Silvia Ross, Dr. Fiona Handyside, and Dr. Olivia Santovetti. They will do sort of quick flash presentations from which we will use to start discussing the futures of girlhood studies. So we are very, very happy to see you all and hope you can enjoy and participate in the following Q&A. And without further ado, I hand over to Olga.
Thank you so much, Federica, and welcome everyone. So today we are going to have, as we said already, a slightly different format. We want to start with an interview with the writer Giulia Blasi. So welcome, Giulia. Thank you for being with us today. Let me say a few words to introduce you. Giulia Blasi is a writer, an Italian writer and a journalist. She wrote and writes for Esquire, Politico, the Italian newspaper Il Tascabile. In 2018, she published Manuale per ragazze rivoluzionarie, which translated sounds like a handbook for revolutionary girls. And then she led a TEDx talk titled "Leading the Revolution" about leadership, feminist and women's leadership. In 2020, she published Z Revolution, Rivoluzione Z, for the Italian publisher Rizzoli, which is another handbook, this time directed to Gen Z readers. In 2021, her latest book named Brutta came out, Brutta, Storia di un corpo come tanti, which sounds like ugly story of a body like many others. Very, very welcome, Giulia. Thank you for being with us today. So you are muted, so I invite you to unmute yourself.
Sorry about that. Okay, just to kick this off, sorry that we had to reschedule this. I am really poor at planning, so thank you for having me, and thank you for putting up with my poor planning. Anyway, on with the questions. And
so Giulia, I am a big fan of your work, fictional and non-fictional. I am going to start with a question that I had since a very long time, since I read Rivoluzione Z. So the work of preparation that you had to do for writing Z Revolution, I am very interested in knowing how you prepared yourself to talk to a generation so much younger than yours, and specifically how Gen Z girls are different from the girl you were a long time ago. Not that long, but.
Okay, well, actually quite long, because I turned 50 a few days ago, less than a month ago. So I'm like fresh into my 5th decade. Anyway, actually, when I wrote Rivoluzione Z, I was coming off Manuale per ragazze rivoluzionarie, which is very specifically aimed at women and young women specifically. But I felt that there was a lot lacking with regards to the younger generation and teenagers and boys, So what I did was basically gather my all those years of observation, of silent observation, of not doing that annoying adult thing of going, oh my God, it was so much better in my days. You know, that thing, that talking down to younger generations. And I thought, okay, so I was a girl in the 80s. How does my experience factor into how I grew up, how I relate to the world, what is different today, and what kind of wisdom can I actually offer to young people that is not judgmental? It's not something, it's not talking down to them. It's not saying or telling them to do things differently because it worked better when we had, like, say, no phones or no internet. And when we had to ring a doorbell to see friends, you know, that sort of thing. That's very annoying. I hated when I was younger, I hated when older people told us that we were bad humans just because we did things differently from how our parents did. Mm-hmm. And that happens to every generation. So I didn't want to be like your scoldy mum. I wanted to be like a kind of a friendly aunt, which I am, by the way, because I have a 15-year-old nephew and a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. So basically what I was trying to do is, let's see if I can talk to these people like they're people, not like they're, you know, incomplete human beings, and just give them some perspective. What I think I learned from being a girl and being a feminist that might turn out to be useful to them in growing up. And that was basically all the preparation I did. And then what the thing is, when I was writing it, COVID struck. So much of that book is really affected and heavily influenced by the kind of dread that we were all experiencing. And I was trying to work through it in writing, and by doing this heavily political writing aimed at 14-year-olds. So that was probably the hardest thing when I was doing it. And yeah, but there wasn't much background work at the time, because basically I had been prepping to do that for the best part of my life. So yeah, those two books came out easily.
I see. And going back to the last part of my question, how did you find any differences working on this topic between the girl you were and the girls you were talking to?
Yeah, I mean, the world has changed, hasn't it? It is a different world. We communicate differently, and even activism is different, and people just interact in a way that is completely different to how we did in the 80s when I was a girl. At the same time, I think teenagers are always the same. They're basically the same kind of human in different iterations. There's always that uncertainty, that feeling like you're all grown up, and you're trying to understand who you are, and you're trying to come into your own and find your boundaries and really define yourself. And at the same time, you just chomping at the bit because you really want to go out there and experience the world in a way that you probably don't when you're a child. So so many things are the same, and so many things are the same because these children are our children. So we raised them. So the best thing we can do is try to patch up the mistakes that we made because our parents made mistakes with us. So much of that book is about recognizing that there are differences and there are similarities, and trying to make up for the things that are exactly the same and really shouldn't be.
I see. Yes, I see. And you mentioned something extremely interesting earlier utmost importance, I would say, for the discussion today, how activism itself has changed. So not only the generations we are talking to, but also the language of political activism. I think this is today the biggest challenge, especially for a feminist who comes after so many theories, so many other forms of activism. And this leads me to the next questions, especially in Manuale per ragazze rivoluzionarie, the handbook for revolutionary girls. You mentioned the importance of internet and networks for girls to make a network. Sorry for no pun intended. So for girls to come together to gain awareness of their position as girls in society. And I was wondering whether you would say that that specific relationship that in the 70s, in the 80s was considered and known as entrustment, the affidamento, so to say, can be found again also in the context of the internet. So how this evolved? Is there any connection from that form of getting together, getting political together, gaining awareness, and the new forms of aggregation that are happening today in the internet?
This is a very complex issue because on the one, when I wrote Manuale per ragazze rivoluzionarie, it was a different world. Again, everything moved very quickly. And 5 years ago, 4 years ago, when I wrote and published that book, even activism was different. There was a lot of it, but there wasn't so much of a turf war around it, because it wasn't, at the time, feminism wasn't cool. Let's face it. It was beginning to come back, but it wasn't cool at the time. So very few people were going to go out there and be, call themselves feminists because that was going to be good for their personal branding. So I think that kind of ruined parts of it. And at the same time, we cannot go back because so many people have gone into feminism since. And that's also because social networks were there. So much of the message went faster. But, when things go fast, sometimes they stay at a very superficial level. So there's good and there's bad. There's, quickness. You can find people more quickly, and you can communicate with them more quickly and reach them more quickly and organize quickly. Which is why in Iran these days, the first thing that the regime did was shut off social networks and severely curtail internet access, because that's a channel. People use it to aggregate, to congregate, to convey messages, just deliver messages, just tell people, let's go here, see what's going on here. So it is something that's helped immensely, but at the same time, it has drawbacks, because you cannot reduce something as complex and human as feminism to a few slides, to a few cards, to a few Canva slides on Instagram, to an Instagram story. It needs complexity, and it does not deal in absolutes. I'm gonna quote Star Wars here, because really Star Wars is all the philosophy we need. Only a Sith deals in absolutes, and I think that what feminism needs is awareness of complexity, awareness of human feeling, awareness that purity is impossible. We need to be bad feminists. It's much preferable to be mediocre feminists than not be feminists at all.
I see, I see. Thank you, Giulia. And I was wondering whether you could say a few words about that time you started a hashtag, speaking about new forms of engagement. For example, I think this is quite an interesting story.
I think I have to be honest here. When we started Quella Volta Che, which translates as that time when, it was 3 days before Me Too came back. So we had no idea. We had no idea what was going to happen. We thought, okay, everyone has one or more harassment stories to tell. We have stories of sexual abuse, of sexual violence, of sexual harassment. Let's all go public with our stories and see what happens. But I thought, okay, it's going to be 10 tweets, a couple of posts, and then we'll call it a day. And I don't know what, honestly, I have no idea what happened. 3 days after we launched the hashtag, it was still going. And then Me Too came. And in the meantime, the French started Balance ton porc. So there was something really huge going on. And at that point, my companions and sisters and brothers, because we did have boys, well, men actually in the group, because we're all a bit long in the tooth, but anyway, we decided that it would be okay for me to, as the creator of the hashtag, it would be wise for me to just go on the offensive and start doing as much press as possible to try to sort out, to explain what we were trying to do. And I knew I didn't have much time. So I knew I had a week at best before the conservative press started firing at us, which is exactly what happened. But in that week, I think I did 16 interviews, something like that. I was on telly all the time. And I was at the point where I hated myself, seeing myself on screen. And I had started shouting at songs. You know, when Kendrick Lamar in Humble says, "Sit down, bitch." And I'm like, oh, shut up, Kendrick. So that was, more or less where I was at. And I think that in retrospect, we didn't know what we were doing. We really didn't know what we were doing. And whatever came after was basically the result of us being really steadfast and not getting dragged into in the mud, just staying on point, staying on message all the time. So whatever result we had from then came from us just staying on message all the time.
That's a new form of engagement, and that's exactly, that's a very good example. But you became a point of reference for a lot of younger feminists, young girls that came to you for advices in terms of political.
Oh yeah, yeah. I always say that you should never have heroes and you should never have models. There's this thing that's being really nagging at me for years now, how we tend to, I know representation is important, okay? We need to see things to want to be things, and that's okay. That's completely normal. But at the same time, I think we should stop talking about role models because people are going to disappoint you. Your heroes will fail. So never have heroes, never be a fan of anyone. Just listen to people, welcome what they have to say, remain critical. People will fail you. People will pass. Ideas will stay. So I am happy if I managed if the past 4 years I have somehow managed to make people feel better about themselves, listened to, appreciated, somehow included in a conversation that was going to go, that was probably not going to happen if we hadn't started it collectively. But it was always threatening to be exclusive, and I didn't want that. So if I managed that, I'm happy. And so much of the feedback to my books is people telling me it felt like having a big sister sit down with me and tell me what's what. And that's a massive compliment. I really loved it. And I love how the love that I have for what I do and for the things that I believe in shown through in my writing. But at the same time, I don't want to be a hero. I don't want to be a role model. I'm nothing. I am just, somebody who reads fantasy books and has a very rudimentary knowledge of feminist theory. So don't come to me for feminist theory, because seriously, I'm not your girl. But at the same time, I don't know, probably come across as fierce enough that people who are a bit shyer than me feel vindicated.
And we were just talking about your non-fictional production, but your fictional production is just as powerful. And
yes, I don't know if it's powerful, but I love it. I love it so much. I love doing fiction. So
so very well, because this is going to be my next question for you, Giulia. So I was wondering whether you could give us your opinion on the representation of girlhood and girls in contemporary pop culture, and if according to you there is something missing, and if you are just by any chance trying to fill this gap by writing something representing girls nowadays, something fictional, if you want to.
Okay, I think that girlhood, the way we represent girls, the way girls represent themselves has never been as nuanced and complex and interesting as it is now, because of what I said, because women and girls are now present in so much fiction and so many TV shows and books and audiobooks and Wattpad fan fictions and so forth. So there's a lot of representation, and it's more inclusive, more diverse. There's finally talk of body diversity, of the representation of people of color, people of with disabilities and so forth. So this wasn't happening when I was a girl. This really wasn't happening. So this is happening now because there's a market for it, let's face it. And because women and girls have taken over vast parts of the internet and have started to represent themselves. So there's an increased visibility on what girlhood is like from the people who are experiencing it. Of course, you cannot, I don't think we can rule out the presence of the male gaze. Like, I really liked Euphoria. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, but it's a TV show about teenagers in some kind of America that's never clearly identified, but one of them is a drug addict, the other one is trans, and so forth. So there's a lot of variety there. Very frank talk about drugs and sex, but there's so much male gaze in there, so that at times it feels really exploitative. So that danger is always lurking around the corner. And what I am doing right now, I have a background in young adult fiction writing. I used to love it very much, and then I pivoted to nonfiction because, I don't know, the occasion presented itself, so I did. And it went well. So I don't regret a line that I wrote in Manuale per ragazze rivoluzionarie or the following books, because I think they're really my best work. But I am going to go back to my first love, which is fiction. And I've got a book coming out in March for Il Battello a Vapore, which is an Italian publishing house. And they started this line of romance books for girls, aimed specifically at girls, in order to provide girls with some sort of sentimental education. And my book, when I was contacted by Battello Vapore, they said, "Do you have, we want you to do a romance book. What have you got?" And what I came up with is a story of a girl who is orphaned. She loses her entire family, has to move in with an uncle, which is very a well-established trope in in young adult and middle grade education. But what happens to her is that she starts seeing a ghost in her bathroom. So that's the starting point of it. And it's going to call Scintilla nel buio, a sparkle in the dark. But Scintilla is actually the name of the girl that she sees in the dark in her bathroom, and who helps her navigate through a very complex period of her life. And I set it in Rome, specifically where I live. So everything that's in the book is actually things and places that actually exist, because I go there every day.
This is fantastic news. I'm so thrilled because Il Battello a Vapore is a very, very, very famous, I would say, historical series of books that I also used to read when I was a young girl. So it's very, very popular in Italy, and it's such a great achievement. So we're really looking forward to reading it. It sounds like really fun.
I'm basically finalizing the editing these days. So I've just sent back the second draft of the book. I'm actually very happy with it. I have to be honest, it was really tough going back to fiction, because once you get used to nonfiction, which is very linear, and all you have to do is basically argue your point the best way you can, fiction deals in world building and character building. So when you're building people, it's a completely different situation. To be honest, Miriam, who is the main character, came out a lot snarkier than I thought she would be. But she's also very normal, very much like any girl anywhere. And what I was going to do in that book was build and try to portray the kind of relationship that the kind of first love that you should really have when you're 14. So with somebody you can really, really trust. He's not perfect. He's not. He doesn't come from a great background. He's not Prince Charming, but he is somebody you can trust, and that's something that I wanted to put there. It's really, really educational, and somebody might argue that it's not very realistic, but at the same time, this is what romance is for. Romance books are there to love what food porn is to food. It's about projection and trying to build, trying to experience the kind of sentimental journey that you would not experience in real life.
I see. This is really, really, really interesting. A lot of food for thought, Giulia. So unfortunately, our time is almost up. I could keep talking to you forever and getting to know all the secrets behind this book. But first of all, I'd like to know if there is anyone from the audience who would love to ask a question, or we can move with the round table and ask the questions and reply to questions at the very end for all the speakers. Federica, what would you say?
As you prefer, really. We can give people a couple of minutes to think about whether they want to ask Giulia a question right now, or if they want to jump in after the 3 flash presentations to join the general conversation. So feel free. You remember that you can also type in your questions if you don't want to speak. So that's absolutely fine. We can read it for you.
Oh, there is already a hand. Yes.
Hi, Shauna.
Hi there. Hi, it's Shauna from Canada. Nice to see everybody. Hi, Giulia. Your talk the interview was wonderful. I do research with teen girls and my daughter in particular, and I won't bore you with the details, but so much of my work is about trying to decrease the hierarchy between adults and children. And, to show that children are not just intelligent, but that they have powerful cultural knowledge that we tend to ignore and diminish. And you said all of those things at the beginning of your talk. You don't talk down to kids. You don't like to think of them as bad just because they do things differently. And so much of what adults think negatively about with kids is related to social media. And so I wanted to ask you if you have advice, you know, not just for me, but, you know, advice that I can give to my friends and all the parents who say to me, you know, how do you stand it? Like, how do you not talk down to them? They're just like driving me crazy. You so clearly have a real connection with young people. And there must be a couple of things that you consciously engage with in your head when you're thinking about treating kids as equals.
Well, I try to remember that I'm older. So that's so much that a lot of what they do and like and appreciate and it's just is and always will be incomprehensible to me. Like TikTok, I have tried, but it's just not me. It's not what I am. It's not what I'm. It's not my language. It's not a language that I speak. So there's no point in me trying to work out what TikTok is beyond, you know, what I know about it, because it's just not my generation. It's not my culture. And at the same time, I have to accept that there are things that I will not understand or share with them. Oversharing is another thing that sends up, you know, all sorts of alarm bells in Gen X's minds, because we used to have secret diaries with locks on them that our mothers, well, not my mother, but other mothers used to pick in order to read our diaries. So we had a concept of privacy that's completely different. And now the young people just live everything out in the open, which is at the same time liberating and has drawbacks. And I try to acknowledge that. I try to acknowledge the fact that it was so different when I was younger that I cannot possibly understand all of it. So what I'm trying to do is acknowledge what we did wrong and possibly, you know, warn them of the pitfalls of what they're doing, and just say, okay, you do you, but just beware. And that's basically it. But yeah, what I'm always trying to do is just remember that I'm 50. I'm not going to be 15 anymore. So there's no point in trying to be with it and younger and hip, because I'm never going to be. So I think that resonates with them. You know, when you're not trying to be their best friend, but just, you know, sort of a respectable elder, somebody you can talk to but wouldn't talk down to you. I think that's fine, and they trust you. I think they trust me to a certain point. But the secret to my source is never saying, never talking down, not scoffing at what younger people say or think. Even when I don't agree with them or don't understand them, my policy is never ever to try to belittle their positions, because the chances are that I just don't understand them because they're new.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Giulia. We are very conscious of time, so we're going to keep the questions. Feel free to continue writing up your questions in the chat box. We're going to keep them for the Q&A, because we would like to start the roundtable with our three invited speakers. I'm going to introduce them. I'm going to introduce each of them before their short papers, so that you have a clear idea who they are and what they specialize in. So we're going to start with Fiona Handyside, who is Associate Professor in Film Studies at the University of Exeter. Her primary research interest is in the study of representations of girls and girlhood from a range of different national cinemas. She is the author, among other things, among articles and chapters, of a monograph titled Sofia Coppola, A Cinema of Girlhood, which came out in 2016. So without further ado, to you, Fiona, if you want to share your screen as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Olga and Federica, for inviting me. And it was great to hear what you had to say, Giulia. I'm just going to talk. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe there's obviously been a lot to talk about in terms of generation and digital cultures and digital cultures of girlhood, and convergence culture as well in some of what Giulia and Olga were talking about. And also, I think this notion of futures, which is always kind of very present whenever we're thinking about the figure of the girl. I think she automatically evokes this question of feminist futures. What might the future be for feminism, and also what kind of future is feminism envisaging for girls? It's a kind of iterative process. But yeah, I'm just going to very quickly share my screen with you, hopefully. There we go. So this just to talk to you really about what I have been particularly concentrating on in relationship to questions of girls and girlhood myself, particularly in the last few months. So while I've been lucky enough to be on research leave, I've been particularly thinking about what I'm calling hair stories. It's quite a deliberate play on hair stories, histories, hair and stories. So kind of notions of narrative through hair and through hairstyles. And I'm really interested in how it is that hair has become such an accessible and rich resource for thinking about the specificity of girls. I think it's a really significant part actually of convergence culture. So hair is able to move quite freely across very different textual spaces. So we have sort of idealized hairstyles, of which I think the uber hairstyle, the most significant hairstyle of the 21st century for girls, has been what I call the power plait, which was modeled by Elsa in Frozen, that incredible moment where she made that declaration of autonomy, said, let it go, removed her tiara, and her hair fell out into an incredibly thick plait. And really, that's where I actually start thinking about girls. And obviously, even with that example, we can already think about the multiplicative ways in which hair moves through culture. And one of the things I think is so suggestive about hair is how it moves from representation into materiality and back again. So there are lots and lots of tutorials on YouTube where you can try out fashioning your own hair into an Elsa plait, for example. Obviously, you can go and buy an Elsa plait to wear. So hair becomes this thing that circulates within and between textual and material moments. So it creates representation and experience as an iterative process. And I think even though it might seem a little tangential, I think this does actually speak to some of what we've already been talking about tonight, which to do with activism and representation. And that actually we can't really separate out, I don't think, representations from material realities. The two are completely imbricated each other. And this is possibly even more so the case when it comes to thinking about the digital. And this utter kind of confusion in some ways, I think, of the virtual and the actual. What I'm really interested in working through is how hair, very specific hairstyles, all can kind of configure and speak to the identity girl while also being very different. So what I mean by this is how hair is used to evoke ideas about race, about religion, about secularism, about sexuality, about gender, and how individual girls can, of course, come in and intervene and restyle their hair, so can actually themselves become part of the process of thinking about their own presentations. And of course, the thing about hair is that it's very malleable. So it has this kind of ability to allow us, to a certain extent, to reinvent ourselves. But at the same time, that malleability is constrained and restricted by the material realities of hair as an organic material. So we're always, if you think, within a field of constraint and possibility. And I think that also has kind of rather nice suggestive metaphorical overtones for thinking about the position of any of us as feminist activists within a neoliberal culture. There are possibilities and there are also restrictions and constraints. I'll sort of round up now, but one of the things I maybe want to say is that this is very much addressed to very contemporary cultures of girlhood. And as I'm saying, thinking about them as being fashioned within convergence cultures that move in and out of the digital, in and out of the material and the virtual, within what is really a very particular moment, which I think has been fashioned out of post-2008 recession and the questioning really of empowerment discourses that came out of that, and an increasing emphasis on resilience and the need for resilience. And the girl really as the figure in a really a moment of complete catastrophe and breakdown, economic breakdown, climate collapse, proliferating digital cultures that seem almost out of control, the girl becomes this figure of promise who will rescue us precisely through her ability to sparkle through this. So resilience and sparkle become really intertwined. And of course, the figure who really does this again is Elsa from Frozen. So she's set up as the ideal in this culture. And then what I'm really interested in is how actually different moments can speak back to this. I'm really interested in, the thing I'm really thinking about right now is sort of the multiple possibilities of resilience for girls within narratives of girlhood. So by this, I mean taking resilience and seeing it not purely as something that is a kind of, if you like, an alibi of a very punishing neoliberal culture that just pushes all responsibility back onto the individual, even very young individuals. And I mean, I was just thinking about just what Giulia said there about kind of embodied knowledges of the child. And I mean, of course, and the amount of cultural knowledge that children do have and are drawing on. And actually how resilience can also become a positive, possibly an ethical resource that girls can create to use and sustain each other. So I suppose that would be if you like, my contribution would be to think about how can activism be something that enables resilience to be something that is an ethic, authenticity of the self, without being instantly co-opted into structures that just use it to shore up inequalities. So on that rather massive question, I'll stop. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Fiona. That was fascinating, and I'm sure there will be many questions, and there's certainly a lot of food for thought for our entering conversation. So our next speaker today is Olivia Santovetti, who's Associate Professor of Italian at the University of Leeds. Her research interests include the representation of reading and readers from the 19th century to the digital age, as well as the representation of girlhood in Elena Ferrante's novels. She's the co-editor of a recently published volume titled Lettrici italiani tra arte e letteratura, dall'Ottocento al modernismo. To you, Olivia.
Allora, thank you very much, Federica and Olga. I'm very pleased to be here and give my small contribution to this fascinating series of seminars. Ferrante has indeed given powerful portrayal of adolescent girls, and I'm not going to focus on the Neapolitan novels, although the reflection of Elena on the metamorphosis of her body during adolescence are memorable. And of course, the adolescent friendship between Elena and Lila is very relevant too. Actually, speaking of this friendship, how this friendship is described, this mix of love and hatred, revenge, competition, but also affiatamento, harmony. I was not surprised that the girls interviewed by Danielle Lipkins and Romana Andò in the first seminar had a mixed feeling about Ferrante, or I don't remember if Ferrante was not among their choices. I'm not sure what exactly they watch. I guess maybe there's some episodes of My Brilliant Friend. But I'm very much intrigued to know more about the girls' reaction from Danielle and Romana. I have my theory about it, perhaps having forced my own kids to read Ferrante when they were teenagers, but now I will concentrate on the last novel of Ferrante, in particular on the following points that you see on the slide, which hopefully are interesting, introduce interesting topic for the discussion. So in the next slides, we move on to the first point. So the adolescent or ugly child. I mean, adolescent is the central theme of the life of adults. And you see right here in the very first sentence, the mention to being ugly. Now, this idea of the ugly child is not new in Ferrante. In a 2004 essay republished in Frantumaglia titled What an Ugly Child She Is, Ferrante wonders whether her mother had ever thought, and I'm quoting, the same terrible words which Flaubert's Emma Bovary pronounced about her daughter. And she then observes, and this is the quote that you see in the slide, ugly, to appear ugly to one's own mother. I've rarely heard a better conceived, better written, more unbearable sentence. And Ferrante has revolved the theme of the ugly child to describe the adolescent experience in her final novel. And so on the one hand, The Lying Life of Adults is a classic coming-of-age story, not that of Giovanna Trada, rebelling against the parents, detaching herself from them and becoming an adult. No, she says at the end of, she brags at the end of the novel, as no one ever had before. And parents are no longer on a pedestal from being this extraordinary man, this really nice woman, the only clear figures in a world that was otherwise confused. She sees them as, another quote, the most untrustworthy animals, worse than reptiles. So yes, a story of formation describes this rite of passage. On the other hand, this is also the story of her parents who no longer recognize their beloved daughter. I mean, this is why the father says she's getting the face of Victoria, which Giovanna understands as the definition of being ugly. Now, these are the fateful words which set the story in motion that you see in the very opening of the novel. So their disappointment, which is so painful for Giovanna, mirrors their uneasiness and pain in losing their child, metaphorically, but also literally, because Giovanna is no longer a beautiful child, or rather, she's no longer a child, no longer an extension of themselves, which they can shape, dress, exhibit, make plans about. So growing up means becoming a stranger, becoming the other. And here it means, I mean, quite poignantly, becoming ugly. And in the next quote, you see that the next slide, you see that in a sense, the Lying Life of Adults is staging the trauma of separation. And I'm reading from the second part of the quote where she says that to separate me from them and them from me. It was, she says, she continues, her first experience of privation. I felt the painful void that usually opens up when something we thought we could never be separated from is suddenly taken away from us. Note how, in the first part of this quote, adolescence or the crisis experience in adolescence is described with words that are very similar to the experience of smarginatura. And I'm reading from the beginning of the quote. Maybe at that moment, something somewhere in my body broke. Maybe that's where I should locate the end of my childhood. I felt as if I were a container of granules that were imperceptibly leaking out of me through a tiny crack. The voice speaking is, of course, that of the adolescent protagonist and narrator, trying to locate the very beginning of a story. So everything started when, undergoing a first experience of privation, she stopped being a child and turned into an adolescent, the ugly child of the opening line. In comparison with the dual narrative of the Neapolitan quoted, here we have a single narrating voice, and yet there is a Giovanna before the event that marked the end of her childhood, when she lived in, and I'm quoting from other quotes from this passage, in a well-ordered world as a good girl with loved and loving parents, and the Giovanna who writes the story afterwards, the one who has gone through and come out of the trauma. So we see in the next slide that this constantly changing point of view is the most intriguing feature of the novel. The reader's views also become mobile and unsettled following the undulating motion of Giovanna's mind when she starts her mission of spying on her parents, on the worlds around her. And I'm reading from the second quote. She says, as a result, an incongruous juxtaposition of vulgarity and refinement again became central. My aunt, who was vulgar, became a woman of taste. My father and Costanza, people of taste, became vulgar. So following our obsessive brooding, our perception of the parents, of Aunt Victoria, of the narrated events, and also of Giovanna herself, changes too. We keep reassessing, rethinking what is good, what is bad, right, wrong, beautiful, or ugly. And in this tangled knot, again, a quote from the opening, the readers like Giovanna are losing every old orientation. In other words, the adolescent is not only this marginato subject par excellence, but as a narrator is also the most unreliable. Giovanna not only lies continually, but her position is always shifting. No, and this is the first quote. I wasn't a truly affectionate daughter, and I wasn't a truly loyal spy. So this perpetual oscillation, we see in the next slide, oscillation between lie and truth, make Giovanna rethink another traditional distinction, that between good and evil, which I think is particularly crucial, particularly important for teenagers, no, who are looking for answers to their big existential questions, looking for role models. So in her ramblings, Giovanna discovers how subjective and how porous this distinction actually is. And significantly, the two opposing models, her father, no, this extraordinary man, courteous, an intellectual, etc., and Victoria, the embodiment of evil, no, the aunt witch, tell her very similar things. You see the first quote, Victoria says, without the ugly things, the good ones don't exist. And the second quote, good becomes evil without you realizing, and this is the father. So this discomforting, unsettling urge, which makes Giovanna and the readers with her meddle with the ugly side, no? In this discomforting, unsettling urge, we recognize Ferrante's trademark, no? The irresistible but disturbing quality of her writing. And this is a quote from the interview with Terragni and Muraro. My last observation, I mean, I've not done any research on the reception, so this is the next slide. I've not done any research on the reception of Ferrante among young readers. Or better, in the work I've done on the reception of Ferrante, I've not found many young readers. But to go back to my initial question, when Ferrante was mentioned in the first seminar, I was wondering, I mean, is there the portrayal of girlhood, as in my first question, powerful, appealing, or disturbing for young readers? Is the lying life of adults, particularly in the new next, adaptation, TV adaptation that will be broadcasted in January, it will be more appealing than the Napolitan novels? Or is this unsettling point of view of the adolescent narrator striking any chords in a young audience? And finally, I was again, I'm referring to the first seminar because I was curious about the reaction of the actual girls in school. What about the ambivalent and ambiguous world in which Ferrante's girls live? And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olivia, for a wonderful presentation. Again, if you have any questions and you want to jot them down in the chat box, please feel free to do so. Our last speaker today is Silvia Ross, who is Senior Lecturer in Italian Studies at the University College Cork, where she's also head of the School of Languages, Literatures and Cultures. Her primary research interests include the modern and contemporary Italian novel, textual representations of space and place, Tuscan writers, Italian women prose writers, tribal writing, and criticism. Among her publications, she has edited two collections of essays, articles, book chapters, and a monograph entitled Tuscan Spaces, Literary Constructions of Place. She's currently working on an interdisciplinary project entitled Identity and Conflict in Tuscany, and developing an international research network on Tuscan studies. Over to you, Silvia.
Thanks so much, Federica, for the kind introduction, and thank you as well to Olga, to both of you for involving me in this wonderful series of talks. I just want to check, can people see my PowerPoint all right there? Yeah, just trying to get it to do the slideshow there. Yeah, okay. So yeah, and I just wanted to acknowledge as well that Olga's initiative in this area of girlhood studies as well, because back in, I guess it was it 2021, Olga, we co-organized a panel for the
yes
and on girlhood and friendship, and it was great that it then became a co-edited special issue of Altre Lettere that Olga and Marco Ceravolo co-edited. So what I want to do is just say a few words about some of the themes around girlhood represented in the work of Silvia Avallone, who's a relatively young and successful Italian writer. So she debuted with the novel Acciaio, meaning steel, which was published in 2010 when she was only 26 years old, and it was a very successful novel that tells the story of two working class girls in a steel town called Piombino in provincial Tuscany. And then clearly she's still very interested in the question of friendship some 10 years later when she publishes a novel called Un'amicizia, which traces the friendship between two adolescent girls, Elisa and Beatrice, and then Beatrice, who becomes a kind of media star, and there's a drifting apart, and then there's a reflection in their early 30s on this friendship and how meaningful it was. So what I want to just touch on is some of the themes that are explored by Avallone in these two books, but also I think many of them have emerged in the talks, or at least some that I managed to hear. And so these include a number of areas: generational conflict or intergenerational conflict, which was mentioned by Danielle Hipkins and Romana Andò in their initial seminar at the start of the series, in which they talked about this paradigm of intergenerational conflict being dismantled in many ways by the comments of the girls in their interviews, who actually talked about a close bond between mother and daughter. I want to say a bit about adolescent girls and friendship, which is of course a key trope in terms of girlhood experiences, and also girlhood friendships and sexuality, which I'll touch on as well. And then because I'm so interested in space, I wanted to say a little bit as well about how these adolescent girls inhabit or traverse space in the two texts. So as regards intergenerational conflict in both texts, parents are seen as almost invariably disappointing or distant. In Acciaio, the fathers are either absent or abusive. There's an inept father in Un'amicizia. He's a kind of computer nerd. And the mothers are also either absent or neglectful for the most part in both texts. And in fact, in Un'amicizia, Elisa's mother moves away, goes back to Biella, and leaves her daughter to live with her father. So, and Beatrice's mother is seen as very self-involved and dies when sorry, spoiler alert, folks, when Beatrice is still quite young. So the relationships with parents are really quite conflictual and problematic, and I think are really reiterating stereotypes around adolescent rebellion, the sort of rebel without a cause paradigm. And so are seen as a kind of coming of age rite of, towards the passage into adulthood. And I think this goes against what, some certain feminist scholars have explored, DeBold, Wilson, and Malavé's idea about the mother-daughter connection as helping adolescent girls make that transition into adulthood. So in some ways, it's somewhat cliched in the way the parents are depicted, I think, in terms of the bond with the girls. Then female friendship. Now, I think Avallone is placing a friendship between two adolescent girls center stage in her 2010 novel. Acciaio is, a relatively progressive and courageous literary move, which in fact occurred a year before Elena Ferrante's My Brilliant Friend was published. So she, I guess, caught on to that trend early on. And but that said, the female friendships in Avallone are conflictual and competitive. So, and I think there it resonates as well with Lenou and Lila, of course, in My Brilliant Friend as well, in terms of their tempestuous relationship. And this reminds me also a bit of what LaShawn Daly was talking about as well in the discussion period after her presentation, in which she was saying how you don't often see female friendship as a loving relationship in standardized filmic representations. That often you see these girls as mean girls or as fighting. So in any case, in Avallone, friendship is seen in terms of rivalry, really, rather than a means of solidarity. And then in terms of the representation of girlhood and sexuality, Avallone very much blurs the lines between female friendship and same-sex desire. So yes, friendship can be a loving relationship, and I'll say a little bit more in just a moment about that, but at the same time, critics such as Charlotte Ross and Silvia Ross have identified Avallone's unwillingness to recognize the relationship as a lesbian relationship, especially in Acciaio, as making the text what they call a lesbophobic text. So Marilyn Yalom, for instance, does see friendship and love, however, as overlapping, and she asks, well, she talks about this collaborative work, The Social Sex, The History of Female Friendship, saying, and here I'm just reading the end of her quote, Teresa Donovan Brown and I have explored the overlap between love and friendship and have often found that it is difficult for us to make clear-cut distinctions. What is friendship? Is it so different from love, they ask. Yeah, and I just want to say a little bit also about spaces and friendship and how the two intersect. So, so female friendship can facilitate women's relationship to urban space. Franco Lacecla, who talks more generally about the nature of friendship, sees friendship as spatial, and Leslie Kern, in her wonderful book Feminist City, identifies adolescent girls' rapport with the city as dependent on friendships, and of course she cites the well-known television program Sex and the City. But just to say, Lacecla emphasizes the power of friendship, whether it's male or female, to give us greater access to space. That friendship is very much geographical, it's situated, he says. And Kern talks about female friendships functioning as modes through which women explore the city and claim space which does not cater to their needs or is designed by men for men, right? And she says, girls coming together in urban spaces challenges perceptions about who the city is for. In appropriating abandoned or masculine spaces, the city as patriarchy in glass and stone is recast as a space of possibility. Girls' presence on city streets, a place where they have been deemed out of place, can and should be considered part of the girls' repertoire of resistance to varied modes of control within an adult-dominated patriarchal society. So in Acciaio and in Un'amicizia, you see the girls inhabiting these marginal spaces or spaces of exclusion, to borrow another geographer's term. In Acciaio, Francesca and Anna regularly frequent abandoned spaces, like these polluted and degraded beaches, or a small hut in a park. Likewise, in Un'amicizia, as young girls, Elisa and Beatrice also go to an unfrequented beach or appropriate an abandoned house known as the Covo, which is like a kind of hideout. And so these are what we could argue seen as kinds of closet spaces, if you will, to use geographer Michael Brown's term, that allow a kind of bodily proximity as well between the girls in both texts, and which alludes to a mutual attraction and even, especially in Acciaio, to a sexual desire. So it's more evident really in Acciaio, but it is alluded to as well in Un'amicizia. So I guess just to conclude, what would the alternative to a conflictual and competitive mode of adolescent female friendship look like? And the theory that I think helps me reflect on this kind of idea without resorting to a sort of saccharine or romanticized version of female bonds is the concept of gyne affection, used by Janice Raymond. And she talks really about, she says, gyne affection, excuse me, is not only a loving relationship between two or more women, it is also a freely chosen bond, which, when chosen, involves certain reciprocal assurances based on honor, loyalty, and affection. In this sense, one could say that friendship is a social trust. It is an understanding that is continually renewed, revitalized, and entered into not only by two or more individual women, but by two or more political beings who claim social and political status for themselves and others like themselves. So just to conclude, it's my hope then that such a model of girlhood friendship, one which is based on solidarity rather than rivalry, can emerge in Italian literature in the near future. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Silvia, for this wonderful presentation. And thank you also to all the speakers in the roundtable and the writer Giulia Blasi, who was with us before. I think we have a lot to discuss about. And I am very happy to open the discussion with our speakers and the people in the audience. So first of all, there is a question directed to Giulia that was dropped earlier before we started the roundtable. So I would like to start from here while other questions pops up for our speakers. Let me get to the question. Here we go. Karen Lindo said, can Giulia provide an example of how she approached addressing the young women of another generation by an example that might have been challenging an enthusiastic speaker?
Okay, so yeah, I've had time to think about this, and I think two issues on which I tend to collide or that are thorny when I'm facing, like, say, younger feminists specifically, is the fact that so many of them are now anti-species. So they have very radical notions about human rights and animal rights and how the two things are interconnected. And so many of them are vegans. So many of them have a very strong ethical position with regards to animal rights. And this is something that my generation of feminists hasn't elaborated on very deeply. So sometimes they will challenge me. They'll go, how can feminism actually exist so we don't take care of animal females and so forth? I tend not to, I find that position, say, very ethically interesting, and I don't share it. And I find it very hard to put it into practice and to incorporate it into my own worldview and practice. But at the same time, it's an ethical position, and I accept that it exists, and I do look at it with curiosity and interest, because I see where they're coming from. It might not, might not take root, or it might, but it's a new thing, and I think that young people have a right to pursue pathways and ideas and ideologies that I might not understand because I come from another generation. So that's my approach, basically. Sometimes things come up then I do not fully understand. Another thing that was very challenging for me as a Generation Xer was the concept of gender identity, which was a given for us because we were born like cis women do not have that problem. I was assigned female at birth, and I do identify as a woman. So there was never a problem for me. And so in order to understand what they meant when they talked about gender identity, and specifically the kind of gender identity that is placed outside the gender binary, I had to listen a lot. I had to listen to them and read them and listen to them explain what it meant. And they were so generous with me and with everybody. So I think I'm starting to get the hang of it because I didn't understand it at first. And now I do understand it a little bit better. And I see that so many people here have pronouns and their names. And it's not something that crossed my mind when I entered my name into this. But I see how that makes sense because it's just part of our normal social interactions now. So yeah, the way I see it, everything, there's always a richness that comes from listening and not talking, like not having your viewpoint come across as definitive or something that has to be regarded as superior at all times. So that's and they have taught me so much. So I just tend to shut up really and listen and not talk when I don't know what the thing is.
Thank you, Giulia. I think that I am still thinking of what you said about role models. I think I'm gonna go out of this talk still wondering how a world without role models will look like. And yeah, this is extremely interesting in a moment in which potentially we could have 1,000 of role models to pick from, and instead you challenged us with this statement, very powerful. I'd like to add a couple of things about our roundtable and about the series of seminars in general, especially going back to what Olivia Santovetti said, referring to our first seminar with Danielle Hipkins, which is here. And I saw that she just wrote on the chat. Okay, so yes, the reference was to Elena Ferrante. We opened this series of seminars thinking, okay, the Ferrante fever kind of helped reflecting upon the concept of girlhood, but strangely enough, girls are less interested in the Brilliant Friends saga or any other Ferrante works to read, as readers. So this is such an interesting paradox. And I was wondering what really makes the difference between a book that is written about girlhood, but for adults, and a book that is written for girls by someone younger. For example, now we have a lot of influencers, TikTokers, they are content creators. They're not specifically writers, but they create content for their own audience, which share the same age. So I was wondering, probably it would be interesting to work and analyze more things in that direction. So there is a question that Danielle brought on the chat. She said, such an interesting interview and wonderful roundtable. Thank you to any of our speakers. I would be interested to hear what your thoughts are on whether transnational models of girlhood coexist alongside national models of girlhood. Do these distinctions still matter in convergence culture? And if so, how? So this is a question. Thank you very much, Danielle, for dropping it in the chat. This is a question to all of our speakers. Who would like to answer first?
I don't know if anyone's going to take it, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that because we have so much representation right now, and because we have Disney Plus and so many streaming services, and we have access to so many different representations of so many different girls and women all over the world, sometimes these representations do affect how we write and how we narrate girls in our specific realities. Besides, I don't know, I can't speak for anyone, for everyone, but this thing that I've just handed in is probably the first thing that I've wrote where most of the characters in the story are not of Italian descent. They're like, one is half Russian, one is Ethiopian, one is Filipino, one is Bangladeshi, and so forth, because that's what Rome is right now. And so many people are both Italian and, of another. They belong to both cultures. They bring this duality within them. So it's just the concept of girlhood that's changing, because girls are changing, especially in bigger cities where different cultures coexist. And girls who are born here, they're born Italian, they speak Italian, but at the same time, their families would probably teach them a different language and teach them a different culture. So they live at the intersection between two or even more cultures. And that's interesting and harrowing at the same time, because so many of these girls do not have citizenship until they're well in their 30s because of how dreadful Italian law is. Sorry, I'm taking up so much space. Silvia, I have a question for you. So just let me know when I can ask, if I'm allowed.
Of course you are, of course. Let me see first if there is anyone who would like to reply to Danielle's question. Fiona?
Yeah, well, it was as Giulia was speaking, a lot of what you were saying resonated with what Silvia was saying in relationship to geographies of girlhood. And I'm wondering if it's useful to kind of think about encounters. So, when Danielle said that there's kind of like transnational models of girlhood alongside national models, but I'm wondering if something a little bit more like Giulia is suggesting, that we have kinds of multiplicities of encounters between different cultures that tend to take place actually at kind of a much more micro level, in the space of a street or a restaurant or a bar or a classroom. And there are those kinds of encounters. And then I think it's really interesting to then think about sort of what media cultures do with that, and something like a globalized streaming thing like Netflix and Disney Plus and so on, and how they kind of co-opt some of these spaces. But I think it's really kind of useful to maybe actually draw on some quite classic feminist geographies like Doreen Massey. These kinds of notions of sort of thick encounters that are articulated through sites, really. I think that's kind of where I would sort of go with thinking about those sort of ideas.
Thank you, Fiona.
I might come in there, if I may, just in response to what Danielle was asking, and on foot of Giulia's comments. Like, Avallone's texts really are almost striking in their lack of ethnic diversity. There's very little ethnic diversity, if at all. I would be interested, I haven't done this work, but to see what kinds of cultural references there are that, that are referring to popular culture on a transnational level. I haven't thought about it in that framework, and I think it would be useful to do that. Avallone seems to be more interested in questions of class rather than race. So, and even there, sometimes in a somewhat problematic way. But in terms of the geography, though, if we're thinking about national or regional, she moves from a very specific location of Piombino, which is a provincial town on the Tuscan coast, and then her subsequent novels are set in northern Italy on near Biella, where she's from originally, and then in Bologna, where she studied and where she lives now. But then this last book, Un'amicizia, is quite generic. So it's turned into this sort of provincial Italy, probably still the Tuscan coast, but not specified. So I'm interested to see. I'm not quite sure what's going on there in terms of her move away from regional location, no dialect either, so a lack of specificity there, and perhaps there's something going on in terms of Ferrante as well there. I don't know, Olivia, what you think, but around those questions of sort of even linguistically speaking, there's a lack of kind of local or regional specificity. So yeah.
Giulia, feel free to ask your question.
Yeah, it is probably quite silly, but I was wondering when you were talking about Avallone's text being lesbophobic, which it does compute. I was wondering how much of it was could be read in terms of tiptoeing around the subject and trying not to make your novel into something of a gay novel because of the fear of being classified outside the general literature into genre literature, something that has to be narrowing your public somehow. I was reminded of how Fried Green Tomatoes managed to be. It was a whole novel about a transmasculine person setting up a whole relationship completely akin to marriage with a cis woman, and I don't believe that in the book it is ever called love. Everything, there's so much pussyfooting around it, and then and then in the film that completely goes out of the window. So it's like it's actually called a friendship and not love. And so and I thought, Radcliffe Hall wrote Well of Loneliness such a long time ago, and it's just lost in the mist of time. It's like there was such a long time in Italian literature specifically where lesbians were completely cancelled out of existence, and I think they're like making a comeback now because so many more gay women are writing novels, and they're writing literary fiction or pop fiction, so they feel entitled to put themselves out there. I don't know if it's not even a question. It's more like I don't know if you agree with me, if there's something there.
I think your idea that is she thinking about her readership and not wanting to classify her novel is probably on the mark, because it was hugely successful, and she was only 26 when she published it. So I mean, I think I think she is skirting around the issue. Definitely, she doesn't want to classify the affection between the two girls as lesbian. One character, Francesca, does say, I'm not interested in men, and it's pretty clear that she is lesbian. But there's all this ambiguity. On the other hand, there are studies, and I quoted one from a psychologist called Thompson in the full version of this piece, where she talks about this sort of blurring, the extremely strong bond between young girls that does in some ways resemble, a romantic relationship too. So where's the line? I'm not sure, but I do tend to think that Charlotte Ross and Silvia Antosa are right to say that it's lesbophobic, because if you read Avallone's interviews, she will never say that it's a lesbian relationship. And why can't she? That's kind of sad. But in some ways, I think there are books that predate Avallone by a long time that are more have less of a problem acknowledging same-sex desire, or lesbian relationships. It's Cialente's Natalia, isn't it, that acknowledges the relationship in a more open way, and that's was it 60 years earlier, some more. So
Oliarda Sapienza.
So so in some ways Avallone is quite revolutionary, but also in some ways quite conservative, and that brings me to what Olga was mentioning at the start about the sort of generation gap around things like media, social media, and influencers, because the figure of Beatrice in Un'amicizia she's an influencer. I don't know if she's a kind of Chiara Ferragni type phenomenon, and she's seen as this incredibly successful superstar, and but she's depicted as being really quite odious and hollow. And so is it possible to be an influencer and actually be a person for Avallone? I don't know. So yeah.
I have a question for Olivia, and the last thing you said about readerships, about Ferrante's public not being one made of girls, even though she is writing about girls, it makes me think about to what extent she's actually the author. She's envisioning a different kind of public for work, one that is grown up now, that has matured now, and has the means, the intellectual, the psychological, the affective means of thinking back to their girlhoods, and thinking about also trauma, because the generation that she's depicting is one of the early to go through, I think, both the Napolitan novels, etc. You have also a moment in Italian history where the divorce was introduced, and people were actually experiencing the trauma of divorce, of people separating, of leaving their affairs out in the open rather than has segregated in a segregated private sphere. So where the private trauma became public because it was out in the open, and you have to readjust your life as a daughter or as a son in relation to this new construct of family that of course Joanna rejects. No, she hates it to the bottom of her heart. So I don't know. It's more thought than a question, but that was very interesting also in considering what's the actual age of the Ferrante reader.
This is a very interesting question, to which I'm not sure that I can. I started to do a little bit of work on the reception. Research on Goodreads, the reception of Napolitan novels on Goodreads. And in fact, because I was also thinking about equivalent, literary phenomenon that I had some, because in a way, My Brilliant Friend is the one that has more comments on Goodreads on any other Italian novels. So it's, of course, doesn't, if you compare it with the Normal People or The Handmaid's Tale, but it is on that level, but not as many. Of course, we're talking Goodreads is mainly American English. There are also comments from, from other countries, but it's mainly that is the main bulk of the reviewers. So I didn't. What I'm saying is that I didn't notice many young people. Not young people. I'm sure that the readers of Ferrante are quite young, but maybe more from 20s, 30s, 40s than the people that's why I was wondering about. I was very curious, and it would be great if because I remember that in the seminar Danielle said something about I will tell you later about this. So that maybe they did discuss Ferrante. They did show to these girls some episodes of Ferrante. So I was very curious to know why. Maybe what was the thing that the teenagers like or they don't like of Ferrante. Certainly, I think that maybe I mean, Silvia was talking about this French description of friendship that is competitive, also in Avallone. So maybe this is I'm not saying that is a novelty in Ferrante, but certainly is with that kind of disturbing, you know, quality that Ferrante gives to her prose. My impression is that maybe friendship, I'm not sure if, but this is really, I mean, because I haven't done research on, you know, young readers of Ferrante. So I'm just guessing. And perhaps I was thinking that maybe the portrayal of friendship in this unsettling portrayal of friendship is less appealing for younger people, but I mean, please contradict me if you know better. Than maybe for people that have actually reflected on this. So maybe people that have I'm not saying that they have moved on, but they are more secure in their, you know, I mean, maybe 14, 15, 16, they really count on friends precisely because they have this, you know, they have other struggles and with the parents, no? So it's very important to have the solidarity of friendship. So this is my guess that maybe Ferrante's world is less welcoming, but I'm not sure. I mean, that's why I thought that maybe The Lying Life of Adults is more approachable. And maybe clearly the TV series will be, no, it's a way to check if, because it's reaches more people, if it's talking to younger spectators, younger audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have, so Danielle Ipkin says, we did show one episode. Some girls do watch and enjoy the series, but the immediate broad brush stroke reaction to one episode was it was too slow. Well, it's also part of like the cinema d'autore experience and the kind of, might be a bit of a really foreign in time and space representation for them. I don't know. But then we have also Lydia Icardi, who says, thank you for the very interesting and thought-provoking thoughts. I keep thinking how everything relates to what it is happening in Iran and how girls are defying the regime by putting their bodies on the front line, cutting their hair, reclaiming space and voice long suppressed. A very powerful self-representation of girlhood. And I think she's specifically talking to Fiona as well about this, but absolutely, that's a very insightful consideration. Thank you very much, Lydia. I see Danielle on screen as well. Hi, welcome back. Thank you for joining us today. Do we have other questions, comments? If not, I think we can thank all our speakers for today. Thank you very much for joining us and for presenting your current research and projects during this final seminar of our series. We are truly proud of the work we've done over the past few weeks with amazing speakers from all over the world. And I think we have a very rich now perception of where girlhood studies are going and how girlhood is represented across media. So that's very, very something that we will keep thinking about, right, Olga?
Yes, exactly. And I have the feeling that the research questions we started the series with, some of them have been answered, some others generated new questions. And this is just to say how lively girl studies prove to be nowadays in during these historical times. So thank you for all the contributions, and I really hope to cross your path and your works soon, possibly with the conferences or other series such this one. Thanks a lot.
We also want to thank Shirley Jordan and Godella Vice Sussex for believing in the project, for allowing us to start this seminar series with the Institute, and Cherry Stubbs for supporting us on the other side of the screen, really. And as always, you will be able to find to catch up with the previous seminar events online on the YouTube page of the Institute. And once again, thank you all and have a good night.